Okay, it's time for another controversial, politically incorrect video. Um, Today is election day, and everyone is very, very worried. They are worried about human rights, they are worried about the economy, the pandemic, they are worried about the businesses downtown that are boarding up their windows because either way, something bad will happen tonight. Um, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of human rights because um, the vast majority of my timeline and on Twitter's timeline is human rights. The new Justice Amy Coney Barrett will take away human rights. Greg Abbott is taking away human rights. Trump has taken away human rights. And I want to invite everyone to be a little bit more mm, not hostile. I want towards the concept of human rights, but I want to invite people to kind of think about where human rights come from, not the rights themselves, but the concept of it, and how it kind of came about to be tangled up with the state. And so, um, human rights enjoy the privilege of kind of taking on this divine element. People see it as a natural occurring phenomenon. The way people talk about human rights. It exists in the same way that gravity exists. Like if you throw an apple off a cliff, but it goes up, you would be just as shocked as to see a human rights violation. And that's how people tend to react to these kinds of things. Um, so and it's not just regular people who do this. Lots of philosophers, uh, especially philosophers concerned with the concept of justice, tend to talk about human rights in the same way. John Rawls, for instance, says that human rights naturally follow from the definition of justice. But that's obviously absurd because the concept of justice has been debated, defined, and redefined since at least the ancient Greeks. But the concept of human rights was first formalized in the 1700s. So obviously there's a little bit of mismatching here, but that's kind of the divine element, right? We see it as a natural occurring phenomenon. So when something like this tends to happen, like when we think something is naturally occurring, there is a type of therapy that we can do to kind of look at it with a little bit more nuance and clarity. And that therapy is called history. So there is a philosopher named Hegel who talks about um, the split, a fundamental split in the human being between what he called civil society on one hand and the state on the other. So civil society is like the sphere of society where we are self-interested, egoistic individuals pursuing our own self-interest, right? So this can be anything from leisure to social outings to education, competition, sports, anything that doesn't necessarily require, quote unquote, another participant or even for you to care about another participant. And then the political state on the other is where, um, what do you call it? Is where communal societal decisions are made. And when I say the state, I mean like not necessarily governments, but the realm which government embodies. Um, it can also be laws, law enforcement, different things where politics affect us on a day to day level. Even something as little as traffic stops is part of that political state. So, um, here in the West, especially right now, we conceive of human rights as something that is owed to us and something that we have the right to, as in, I have the right to use the American government's little motto. I have the right to life, I have the right to liberty, and I have the right to the pursuit of happiness. um, or property, I think was the original draft. But in the time of the ancient Greeks, justice or the concept of human rights didn't exist. And so justice was more about a communal harmony. It was about giving people what was owed to them depending on their place on the social hierarchy. And you know, that Plato's noble lie of like the peasantry has bronze in their blood, and so they're like destined from birth to be on the lower end of society. The middle class people were born with silver, I think, and then the nobles and philosophers were born with gold in their blood. And so, if you were born with bronze in your blood, then you know the justice is just whatever was owed to you, which was like your um, the right. See, that's the problem. It's not the right to work for someone else. It is that it is right. So we could call this like generalized rights. So like it is right to work for the nobles if you are a peasant, right? Or we could go even more general. It is right to bury the dead. It is right to um, obey your parents, right? It is right to be kind to one another, whatever. And so um, the ancient Greeks worked more with general rights, but here in modern times we work with subjective rights. So that is, I have the right to, you know. So I have things. I have the rights to have things owed to me. I am entitled to certain things. And so that is where the fundamental split happened, going back to Hegel. So when we switched from generalized or general rights to subjective rights, we had to we had to come about this split, because now everyone was not seen as a little gear in the societal machine as a whole, where everything was harmonious and everything, or at least the attempt to put everything harmoniously. Now we are concerned with individual entitlements and what things that are owed to individual people. So, you know, so right up until now, I've been talking mostly about um, vague ideas, vague, you know, ideals that would be great that are great in theory, right? But ideas don't just happen, right? Nobody just has an idea and then pop, it just becomes real. They need to be materially, socially, and politically integrated into the society in question. So, um, so Christianity, I'm just gonna blow through this really quickly. Christianity was instrumental in allowing people to become atomized, because when you have a soul, you have a direct link to God. And you know, a soul can be totally abstracted from whatever societal context it might be a part of. You could be a 14th century serf, you know, living in southern France, dying of dysentery or whatever, or you could be Joe Schmo next door right now. But it doesn't matter, because on the level of the soul, you both are ostensibly the same person, because you have the same direct connection to God. So because of that, people were allowed to be seen much more individually, and it was much more easier to conceive of human rights as something individualistic and something subjective. Like they have the right to something, access to something, to do something, whatever. And this can even be found in what do you call it? In the Declaration of Independence, that you know, we hold these rights to be self-evident, that each man is made by their creator, right? So Christianity was instrumental in the concept of human rights. But so now we know how we got here, right? We know where human rights come from. We know where they kind of came about. And so it should be no surprise that the majority of uh, well, it should be another thing. It should be no surprise that the first proponents of human rights, um, England and France, the first people to like sign these these documents containing human rights were signed in palaces, but also these countries were also the last to abolish slavery and their slave system. So, and when I say England, I mean like England and America, because their ties weren't exactly broken, but they maintained that same relationship. So now we know how we got here, right? And I promise I'm getting to the election and voting and everything. Just give me a little bit more time. I promise this is going somewhere. So now we have the concept of rights all historicized. Now we know where they come from. Now we know how they came about. But here's something that not a lot of people tend to talk about. It's the enforcement of rights. How are these rights enforced? And I think that a lot of people tend to believe that, good coffee. A lot of people tend to think that human rights are something that a benevolent state or politician or group of politicians bestow upon the working people as a gesture of the ubiquitousness of humanity, of like, oh, oh, you petty pathetic working people, we are going to give you these human rights to make your lives a little bit less miserable. And no, in the vast majority of cases, human rights are consequences of long historical struggles. So, and they usually come out of a compromise. The state, in order to maintain itself, will give human rights as a means of placating whatever movement that threatens their power. So let's go back to the 1910s. The labor movement was incredibly militant. It was incredibly powerful. And this was because a large majority of working people were poor. They were working horrible hours in horrible conditions, and life was just utterly unbearable. Not to mention there were children who were dying consistently in factories, and no one seemed to care. So the working class, got together and created a very powerful militant working class movement that the political state in America had to violently quash. I don't know how many of you know this, but the term redneck does not refer to farmers. It refers to the riot at Mount Bald Mountain. I don't remember exactly the name of the mountain, but it was a huge riot where coal miners were striking in order to get better working conditions and better pay, and the police brutalized all of them, and it was a horrible, bloody riot. And that's where the word redneck comes from, because they wore the red bandanas around their necks. So, so the working class was in a position where it threatened the power of the political state, right? Because we remember in Hegel, there was a split between civil society of individual people, of egoistic, self-interested people, and there was a political state where political decisions and communal decisions are made. Just a little reminder. So the working class was a force to be reckoned with and threatened the power of the state. So the state gave better working conditions, the 8-hour workday, the weekend, in order to quell the working class, right? And that's why everything, that's why working jobs back then paid more than comparatively to right now. And but as time went on, the working class and the labor movement dropped their power. They became less militant, less powerful, less of a threat. So in the 80s, with neoliberalism and Reagan, all of those working rights got rolled back, and the state began to exploit the working class at a feverish pace once again. And so, um, it is fundamentally a struggle between um, you know poor people, the people who at least don't have the power to provide human rights for themselves, so they have to either threaten or beg for human rights from an all-powerful state. And it should be worth noting that the state does not operate the way we think it does. Like, even if people say that the state works for everyone, it must fundamentally um, oblige to the demands of the people that fund it. And, who funds the state? The ruling class, the rich, the ultra wealthy. And I'm not talking about your, like, you know, newly new millionaire who has like $1.1 million in the bank account. I'm talking about the ultra rich. You know, they can buy politicians. They can lobby to hell. They can. Uh, who was it? It was. Um, Fuck. It was a Yale University. Started with P. I think it was Princeton. They did a study of who is like. Is it more likely that the wealthy get their bills passed, or that the large majority of Americans get their laws passed in Congress or in whatever? And it found that um, the wealthy, when they propose, or at least when they pay people to propose bills for them, they are 30% more likely to be passed than legislation that benefits the working people. And that's why we don't have any corona stimulus packages. We got one months ago, and then here we are still. So going back to the concept of human rights, it's not this election is kind of the worst of both options, the worst of both worlds, because the how can I put this? Because we are compromised. It is between a horrible compromise and a horrible future, because we are we we are petrified that these human rights that we've struggled to get as compromises are already being compromised themselves, whether by Trump actively antagonizing them or with Biden placating them with just kind of who did he told some of his wealthy sponsors and donors, or donors, I should say, that nothing will fundamentally change. And so it's we as working people, we are placed in a position where we are begging for crumbs when we could be getting scraps. You know, there is no light at the end of the tunnel for us. It's the we are so wrapped up in the concept of losing or gaining human rights that we are totally blinded to the fact that we are under the thumb of a political state. And it's not a matter of who we can put in charge that will, give us what is owed to us, but rather how can we eliminate the middleman? If the channel of rights goes people, politician, human rights, it should be our active duty, or at least we should think about cutting out the middleman entirely and gaining those human rights as a communal entity, right? We don't need politicians to work for us if they've never been to our communities, or if they've never been to to our side of the world, especially as working people. I have seen how many of these politicians say that, oh, I'm from the middle class, I'm this, I'm doing that, I am such a rustic American. But the middle class is shrinking and presupposes a lower class, and the lower classes will always outnumber the middle and higher classes. So we have been kind of duped into thinking that people who have never seen or felt our struggles can provide for us what we can ostensibly provide for ourselves. It's just a matter of learning about the history and learning about where these things kind of come from. I think that for people who believe that I'm not going to trash anyone. I don't want to make people feel bad. I'm trying to at least present a different perspective. But I have seen constantly people say, your vote is your voice. And to an extent, that's true. But what kind of voice is it? Is it something that can be heard, or is it just a little whisper in the wind? You know, the when people are are totally enthusiastic of having their voice heard once every 4 years, um, I think that's kind of petrifying because the rest of the 4 years, decisions are being made without us. Decisions are being made without our input, without our. Um, hmm? Oh, sorry, text. We are not at the table. I have heard. I forgot who said this, but I've seen pictures of it where it says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Voting is not being at the table. Voting is. I struggle to even say under the table because we don't even get the privilege to see the decisions being made. It Voting, it feels like um, it feels like a parent giving a child decisions, and but in reality the parent makes the decision. We are we are blinded to the fact that we ostensibly have no power, that voting is totally a symbolic gesture. Bernie Sanders, I think he went um, on NBC, or maybe it was CNN. He said that Democrats are more likely to um, vote by mail-in ballot, and Republicans are more likely to vote in person. So today, on election day, all these Republicans are going to, and their ballots are going to flood the polls, and they will be counted quickly. And meanwhile, the vote in ballots are going to slowly trickle in over the next couple of weeks. So as the numbers begin to pop up on the election race shows, um, the Trump is going to see all these red states pop up. And I think he's gone on record saying that he won't concede the presidency, right? So at the end of tonight, according to Bernie Sanders, Trump is going to see all these lights pop up. He is going to declare a victory. And then Biden, avoiding confrontation, will concede the election. And as the votes trickle in over the next couple weeks, he will see that he got the majority of the popular vote. And it will be 2016 all over again. So all of this doesn't really matter because all the Democrats already voted early. I actually don't know who's voting today because the majority of people on my timeline voted early, whether in person or by ballot. But these are just my thoughts about human rights and about how voting is kind of us conceding our power away. The state is ostensibly a mechanism that pits the rich against the poor. And we, as working people, will always outnumber the rich, the people who, take our money, take our rights, take our time, take our decisions. And I think that people should be, they should not stop at voting. I think that's something that people should do. They should not stop at voting. If if the extent of your political action or of your awareness or critique or even just involvement begins and ends at voting, I think that it would be wise to maybe broaden your horizons a little bit. Everyone can always broaden their horizons, even me. I try to constantly learn about what's happening, but that I think that I've been talking way too long, and that um, I think that we should want more. We should want more, right? We live our whole lives working, paying bills, paying taxes, paying, you know, we are born into debt and we die trying to get out of it. We um, we live our lives undemocratically. You don't decide when to come into work. You don't decide how much you get paid. You don't decide where you want to go to school, where you want to live. I mean, you do in the sense that you can afford it, but if you're living in a community that is impoverished, crime ridden, over policed, um, the choices that you have are incredibly limited. There's a joke online that says punishment by fine means legal for the rich, and I think that's very true. Um, I think that we should want more, because when we spend our whole lives giving to the state, to our bosses, to whoever we answer to, and we don't get anything in return, or we get the bare minimum, I think that something is drastically, drastically missing. And I think that we should want more.